Hello, my name is Andrew Evans, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about some representations of depression and anxiety. In particular, this video is going to be focused on three different representations. The first one we're going to be talking about is Ali Brosh's online comic series. So the first one is called Adventures in Depression, and the second one is just called Depression Part 2. And that is where she chronicles her own experiences of having depression. So that's a real life, non fictional account. Then we're going to be looking at how BoJack Horseman, the television show from Netflix, represents depression, anxiety, and addiction. And in particular, we'll look at season 4, episode 6, which is called Stupid Piece of Shit. And there's a clip of that available on YouTube for you to check out. Also, we will be talking about how anxiety is represented in the show Big Mouth, in particular, season 4, episode 1. And there's also a clip of this available on YouTube. It's represented as a mosquito. I do want to note here at the beginning that the BoJack Horseman clip does discuss suicide. And part 2, in particular, of Brosh's depression comic discusses suicide and not wanting to be alive anymore in some detail. So I wanted to just provide that content warning here at the beginning. But before we really get started talking about these representations of depressive and anxiety disorders, I thought it might be important to just look at how we in general characterize these conditions. So, at least from the perspective of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, this is how these conditions, or this is one of the ways these conditions are described. And both of these descriptions come from the DSM 5. So, depressive disorders. Quote, the common feature of all these disorders is the presence of sad, empty, or irritable mood, accompanied by somatic and cognitive changes that significantly affect the individual's capacity to function. Anxiety disorders, quote, anxiety disorders include disorders that share features of excessive fear and anxiety and related behavioral disturbances. Fear is the emotional response to real or perceived imminent threat, whereas anxiety is anticipation of future threat. So, um, you know, it can sometimes be difficult to distinguish between depression and anxiety, and the manifestations of these conditions are so different across people. But this is a way that we can sort of think about it, at least going through in this video, that depressive disorders have more to do with mood, feeling sad, empty, or irritable, right? There's also some bodily or cognitive changes. Anxiety disorders are more about fear and anxiety. And here a distinction is made between fear and anxiety, but the DSM does note that these things, of course, often go together and overlap. And also, depression and anxiety often go together and overlap. It's often the case that people are feeling down and low and also very fearful and anxious, right? So we should just keep these things in mind, that they're not the most distinct things, but when we're talking about it in this video, these are some of the things we're talking about. Okay, starting with Ali Brosh's comic Adventures in Depression. This is a really interesting comic that's available online. I think it's on her blog called Hyperbole and a Half. And there are two different comics. One is called Adventures in Depression, and the next one is called Depression Part 2. And it really goes through her own experiences with this condition. And I think it's a really strong and interesting portrayal. It is dark, though, right? It is a very difficult at times read. And like I said, part 2 in particular gets into some of that suicidality. For Brosh, it seems like her depression started with feeling very sad, having a lot of feelings. And that seemed to come out of nowhere, right? She doesn't have this sort of precipitating event. But eventually she started to feel numb. It was like she didn't have any feelings. And then by the end of the comic, she starts to feel things again. But the comic doesn't end on a particularly positive note. It's not exactly a happy ending. And I think what she's trying to do here is give a real representation of what it's like for her without sugarcoating it. I don't think she's trying to give a representation of what depression is like in general, right? She's just giving her own personal experiences. And I think she's trying to be real about it without, ending with a happy ending that might not fully represent reality. It seems like there's been some improvement for her, but it's not as though everything's all better now. One of the most powerful parts, I thought, is when Brosh talks about her emotions. And when she was feeling numb, it felt like her emotions were dead, like she just didn't have emotions, that they were, that she couldn't revive them, right? And she uses this analogy to fish. She said when people tried to cheer her up and find her emotions or make her feel happy or consider other things, it was like she had these dead fish and people were trying to feed them or people were trying to find them. And the idea was that, she knew where they were and she knew that feeding them wouldn't work. It's just that they were dead and that was the problem. And I just thought this was a really good, interesting representation of what it felt like for her to feel that sort of numbness, to feel emotionless, right? The solutions that people were giving her weren't particularly helpful because they weren't really understanding what she was feeling. She really wanted someone to just say, I'm sorry that your fish are dead, or, I still like you. It's okay that your fish are dead, right? Something like that. Showing empathy rather than trying to find a solution when they really didn't understand the problem. Okay, moving on to Bojack Horseman. So, in this episode, Stupid Piece of Shit, it follows Bojack throughout his day. And through the whole time, he's clearly plagued by a sort of inner voice, and it's constantly putting him down. And there's a lot of self hatred there. There's also this sense that the inner voice is never really sure what to do. Right? It seems confused at times. It seems like he can't figure out what to do next. There's some inability to act, right? Um, and I think this is meant to be a representation of Bojack's depression, anxiety, and addiction. If you watch the show, you learn quickly that Bojack deals with conditions like this. That he has a problem with alcohol, that he's dealing with chronic depression and anxiety, and hasn't processed some of the difficulties from his past and his current destructive behaviors. It's a really excellent show. It's probably my favorite show. Um, and this episode is a particularly strong one. But I will say, that this clip that I'm referring to is just on YouTube, and there's one from the beginning of the episode and one from the end of the episode, where Bojack in the first one is waking up and hearing this voice putting him down. And by the end, he's talking to Hollyhock, another character, and she talks about having a similar voice. And he sort of reassures her that eventually it goes away, but clearly it doesn't for him. I think this is another really interesting, though this one's fictional, it's a really interesting, I think, raw portrayal of what living with these conditions can be like for some people. Okay, and then the last thing we'll talk about is the Big Mouth episode called The New Me. And this is the first episode that introduces Tito the anxiety mosquito. And Tito is meant to represent anxiety. So Big Mouth is another Netflix show, really good show as well. And it does a really good job of sort of representing emotions and mental health conditions in this way. This isn't the only one that it does this with, but it's a particularly effective one. So in this clip from YouTube, Nick is worried about what other people are thinking of him. He's worried about being left out. And the mosquito shows up and just sort of amplifies these worries. It sends him down this rabbit hole, down this spiral. So what I think is interesting in this clip, unlike the other things we looked at, is that it sort of externalizes the mental health condition, right? And this show does this in general. I think we're meant to recognize that the anxiety or the depression is part of the character, but it does actually give a character to these things, right? It's a mosquito that represents anxiety. It's not just a voice inside his head like it is for Bojack or Ali Brosh. And part of the reason this could be the case is that Big Mouth is about children, right? Rather than about adults. All three of these, I think, are just really good portrayals and interesting portrayals of what it's sometimes like for some people, right? We can't generalize what it's like for some people to have these conditions and go through the course of their day. All right, so we're just going to end with this short writing exercise. I'd like you to spend a few minutes looking over these questions, thinking about them, and then a few minutes writing out some answers. So, the first question: how did your feelings change over the course of reading Brosh's Adventures in Depression comic? What was your reaction after you finished reading? As I mentioned, this comic kind of really follows a trajectory of how things changed for her. So, did your feelings change as you were reading it? Another question: each representation we looked at had some sort of inner voice in it, right? Brosh's depression spoke to her. Bojack had a voice that put him down. Nick was anxious, and the sort of mosquito represented that anxiety. It wouldn't stop sharing its worries. Why do you think these creators represented depression and anxiety as if they were their own characters? Now, of course, it's a little different between them. In particular, as I mentioned, it's a mosquito in Big Mouth, and it's more of an inner voice in the other two. But in each case, it sort of feels like the depression and anxiety is its own thing, its own self, its own character. Why do you think that the creators of these works wanted to do that? What do you think they're trying to get across there? And I think this begs an interesting question. Is it the case that our mental health conditions are separate from us? Or are, in some sense, are they part of us? And what do you think these creators were trying to do? Are they trying to say that, Bojack's voice isn't really him, or it's a part of him? Is Nick's mosquito, right, actually part of him? Or is it his anxiety somehow separate from him? I think that's a really interesting question with mental health conditions in general. All right, well, that's all I have for that video. Thank you for watching.